Hello, I'm 8mm Mauserman, and before we get into the rest of this video, I would like to say thank you so much to my friend Justin for this awesome 8mm Mauserman hat. Now, chronographs are expensive, and they're also not bulletproof. So this video is going to be my walkthrough of what I did to make sure that I did not shoot my chronograph from start to finish. 1312, 1340. The chronograph that I use is a Caldwell Ballistic Precision chronograph, and it's worked pretty well for me. I've had a few errors to read, but generally speaking, it's been pretty reliable. So I know this is a pretty silly thing to start off with, but the first thing that I did to make sure that I did not shoot my chronograph, and I know some of the internet commandos are going to be upset with this, was I used a Nerf gun. And I got really close and shot my Nerf gun through the chronograph, and what that did was it gave me an idea of the areas of the chronograph that it would actually read. So the sensor is right here. It only really reads when it's directly above the sensor. And the other thing I learned is that although I can get as low as here, I can also get as high as about here. So I have a pretty decent window of where to hit. I don't necessarily need to be firing right here. Now, it was a much easier and cheaper way to do this with a Nerf gun than a real gun. However, if you don't have something like a Nerf gun, you could probably use something like an airsoft gun or paintball gun if you do have that. And you could also do something like a 22 or something similar, and that might be able to provide some help. However, there are two things to be aware of if you go that route. The first one is, of course, make sure you have a backstop and make sure that wherever you are pointing the gun when you pull the trigger is not going to break your chronograph. If I hit it with the Nerf gun, nothing happens. If you hit it with a real gun, you're going to break it. The second thing is, chronographs work by measuring the light as the round passes through. I found this out when I tried to measure and test the area with the Nerf rounds when I was in my basement, which had fluorescent lighting. Because fluorescent lights work with constant flashing, it made the chronograph act out. So although you can use a chronograph in standard lighting like the kind I have in my house, it really works best outside in the sunlight where you have one large light source. So what that all means is that if you are shooting a 22 or any type of gun really through the chronograph at a close range, you have to be cautious about the muzzle flash. At a distance, the muzzle flash isn't as big of a deal because of how deep the sensors are inside of here. But if you were going right up against it, which is, by the way, against this chronograph's manual, so do that at your own risk. But if you go up against it, you need to make sure that whatever you're shooting doesn't have any muzzle flash. So the first thing I did was use a Nerf gun or something similar to measure the range of where my chronograph would actually detect information. The second thing I did was when I first started shooting through my chronograph, I checked every rifle I fired through it on this paper target. And the point of that was to see if any of them hit low or high compared to what it was. My Ishapore 2A1 has a higher height over bore than my Mauser, so you can see a little X right here, and that X is where I would aim when I was using my Ishapore 2A1, so it would hit right here in the center, versus aiming at the center and having it hit low, having a higher chance of actually hitting the chronograph. So I just tested each round I would fire through it at first, until I felt comfortable to shoot it without using this. Now, I intentionally set this up in a way so that if I was prone or if I had this sitting on a table, I would have it set up like this and I would know exactly where to shoot through the chronograph to get consistent hits every time. And it actually worked out really well for me. You'll notice in my earlier videos I didn't quite have a dedicated bipod to use specifically for this, and I didn't have a table at the range I was shooting at, so I just had this laying on the ground and I would lay prone and fire through it. So the idea of going prone was kind of annoying and also made it harder to record, especially with audio. So eventually I found a dedicated tripod that I could use specifically for filming when I was using the chronograph, and that is what this tripod is right here. This is actually the first tripod that I used for filming until I found a better tripod that I used for filming, and now I use this one specifically for the chronograph. This one I think was $20 on Amazon, and it does buckle a little bit under the weight of the chronograph since this chronograph is kind of heavy and this tripod is really cheap. But you can see that on the bottom it has a standard camera screw so that you can screw this into any tripod that you could use for a camera. So this $20 Amazon tripod works well enough, especially for something that I'm shooting at. I don't want to put a lot of money into this. The downside of the tripod is that if you don't quite have enough confidence to shoot without a paper target, you can't really use the tripod and the paper target at the same time unless you attach the paper target directly to the sunshade poles in the back. I guess that is a possibility, but you might have some issues taking in light, which is necessary for the two sensors. So to recap, first thing, use a Nerf gun or something similar at first to see where your chronograph takes its best readings. Shoot at a paper target at the range that you think you are going to be shooting at your chronograph through so that you can see where the round impacts compared to your sightline. That will help you be aware of the height over bore of whatever you are firing through this. Whenever you feel comfortable shooting without having a paper in the back, you can get a tripod if you don't have an actual table that you normally have it set up on. And the final thing is, I've never actually shot the chronograph, but I have shot the chronograph poles. So 2 of these chronograph poles are constructed like this. It's made out of a thinner metal that I just found at a local hardware store, and I wrapped some electrical tape around to make them the right diameter to hold the sunshade in place. I would recommend, before you take your chronograph out, to buy and cut a few spare poles to size, and that way you just have them on hand in case you need them. I think you're a lot more likely to shoot the poles if you are shooting through the center of the chronograph than you are to actually shoot the chronograph itself. What happened to me the first time that I shot a pole was I had a severe hang fire, so I had moved the rifle slightly after I pulled the trigger, and I had anticipated the recoil, which just led me to shoot in the wrong spot. The second time, I was just shooting too fast and didn't take the time to line up my sight picture, so I just hit off to the side a little bit. I was using my Ishapore, so I don't know if I took one of these side sight protectors and put that as my front sight instead of the front sight itself, or if I had some sort of other issue. I'm really not quite sure. But in my opinion, you are much more likely to shoot the poles than the chronograph itself, and those are much easier to replace. So before you take your chronograph out, I would recommend having 1 or 2 on hand just thrown in your chronograph bag. I'm 8mm Mauser man, and I hope this video could save you some money. But as for me, I shot 2 of my chronograph poles that I lived on.
Which proves it's hard to get the best of a man named John.
John.